Thank you. Traidcraft is rather peculiarly both a company and a charity. And from the company point of view, we are importing goods and selling them on fair trade terms. And I suppose what drives our business engagement is a belief that that kind of a model is possible and we can demonstrate it. Is business transforming development for better or worse? Well, let's think first of all about income and the share of income that goes to different parties along the supply chain from producers in developing countries to consumers here. Where companies are looking for raw materials, there is a very important issue of rent. There is money, rent available if you can get control of those raw materials, and how that rent is divided between the country itself, between the company, within the country, between the elite and between citizens and workers, is a matter that is essentially a matter of power and choice. And that's why our colleagues in Christian Aid are campaigning hard on issues of tax and on issues of transfer pricing. Where is it that value is said to be added in a chain so that the country, the developing country that has the raw material in the first place, can get the benefit from it? The second way in which the share of income is determined concerns things like wages and the amount that is paid to a peasant producer. Now, this also is, at least in part, a matter of power. And it's a matter of expectations. If we can create the idea that companies ought to pay a living wage, then the negotiation between company and worker gives the worker that much more power. If the workers themselves can be organized under freedom of association rules that the ILO has put forward, then they will also have more power and stand a chance of getting more out of the relationship. All of which I think demonstrates that whether business is good for development or not depends on sector to sector, country to country, power relations here and there. The fair trade movement has now expanded. I think in 1997 here in Britain, £17 million was spent on fair trade. This year it'll probably be £1 billion. In that fair trade movement there are things that go wrong, but producers who are selling in fair trade will be getting a minimum price and there'll be a premium on top of it made available. What about outside the fair trade chain? Well, some companies are practicing ethical investment. One of the things that we have done in Traidcraft is to work with the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply on what constitutes good purchasing practice if you are a company buying from developing countries. And it involves things like giving reasonable lengths of contracts, keeping to your contract, not reducing the price after you've signed it, and various fairly obvious things like that, and some things which are not so obvious, which makes life easier for a supplier. Now, it does seem as though it is possible to construct a model where you do pay reasonable wages and you can import large volumes from developing countries of things like garments and sell them in Britain. It seems to be possible. But many companies don't do that. Many companies are laggards rather than leaders in this field. And for those companies, the problem is precisely, as Professor Stiglitz was saying, to align their incentives so that they have to. And this is one reason why we have been arguing for better regulation. And for example, in the case of the supermarkets, we in Traidcraft have been arguing, and I'm pleased to say that the coalition government has agreed, that there ought to be an ombudsman for suppliers to supermarkets to go to and say we have not been fairly treated. and then the Ombudsman can rule one way or the other. And those suppliers shouldn't just be the National Farmers Union British farmers, but that Ombudsman should be available to developing countries' suppliers as well. And that's something that we'll be campaigning for, and if anybody cares to send further postcards to the government to encourage them to get on with it, that would be very welcome. The last thing I wanted to say was to go back to this question about, is business transforming development for better or worse? And that is that development is not just about income. And this is something that, again, Professor Stiglitz has worked on. There's much more to people's well-being or happiness than their income. There are issues of status, of community, of relationships, of all sorts of other things which we know make people more or less happy. Now, in some cases, business involvement has created big changes in this. For example, in the Bangladesh garment industry, women who previously were confined to their homes have been able to go to work in the garments industry, to associate together, and to acquire a wholly different kind of status. Viewed from here, that looks like a very positive development which business delivered. It wasn't one that business deliberately delivered. It wasn't that they sat down and said, this would be a useful objective, let us try and deliver it. And that's why it seems to me very important that when we look at these broader issues of values that matter to people, those too have to be, businesses have to have incentives that will lead them to deliver those as well. And it's probably the case that if businesses just try and deliver all those things themselves, it would be completely hopeless, not to speak of thoroughly paternalist. But what it does mean is that businesses have to work in partnerships with local authorities, with civil society on the ground, so that the needs of people for education, for community, for anything that the community themselves decide they want, are met. So that kind of partnership relationship is something that businesses may decide to do, or again, it may be possible to build incentives so that they are encouraged to do it in their own interests.